through that, as I say, over 7 years of completed years, we have over 100 alums out there who are starting to now build an impact in the community, both in Abu Dhabi, in the other Emirates, but also overseas. So we're starting to see a number of our fellows turning up in MFA programs in the top schools in the world, coming back and teaching, but also now setting up their own collectives, starting their own movements, contributing back to broader society. So it's been really satisfying that this community and critique model is still carrying on, and we're due to start our 8th cohort in April. We also oversee and run Warehouse 421, which many of you will know is in Mina Zayed. 5th anniversary, we run a number of activities. It's this beautiful but understated space that really tries to talk about the nature of audiences. So whereas we're creating artists in our SHF program, Warehouse 421 is really about what it means to consume art, what the role of art is in the world, really taking the role of artists and creative practitioners as cultural leaders. So thinking of artists as thinkers, not just doers. And so we try and really sort of create this place, this sort of go-to space where they can engage with conversations, they can engage with objects, they can engage with just proposals that are going on, or experiment. So it's a space of experimentation where we try and collect ideas, thoughts, artistic imaginations, artistic imaginings. We also host some outdoor cinema evenings and try to really support local talent. So Warehouse 421 is really this place where it's a regional commitment to local artists and creative practitioners. No matter what their domain is, no matter what stage they're at, we really want to try and encourage them and keep them coming back. We also partner with a lot of embassies, so this is the French embassy, and we host debates and we talk about this whole nature of what does art actually mean? What does art actually do? What is the role of art in identification? And really, we ask questions. We don't necessarily answer things, but we ask a lot of questions. And in that, people make their own assumptions, their own connections, and their own answers. We also run a series of workshops. This one is one on perfume making. And we try to get people to engage actively in their culture. So rather than sort of passive consumers, we ask them to become active consumers, to actually sort of engage in the making of culture. So culture isn't a thing, culture is a happening. So Warehouse 421 is a place where you can come and roll your sleeves up and have a go at making your own culture. We also took over a program that started at Zayed University called Lest We Forget, and I've included this one in particular because it's an oral narrative research project where we collect the stories from the region. And this is a really important role the foundation plays because we keep bringing in stories and examples from overseas. We need to start developing our own research from the region, by the region. And so Lest We Forget is this group that really starts not only collecting those stories, but also thinking about how do we tell those stories back to ourselves? How do we actually see ourselves in our own work and our own narrative? And so it's about exhibitions and dissemination and publications, but fundamentally it's about us, it's about you, it's about how we together make sense of where we are in this world, the rituals, the cultures, the stories, how we have become who we are, and the richness of those stories. And we collect things, so we're also an archive, and we collect these stories, not just of the major moments, but those micro moments, those little aside moments that actually build to bigger moments. We also oversee the UAE's National Pavilion at Venice Biennale, both the architecture and the contemporary art one. And we have been doing that for a number of years. We are supported by the Ministry of Culture and Youth and also by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And what we do is we commission. We act as commissioner, we do the call. We also help the artists and architects to become researchers. So once again, the mission here is to tell the untold stories of the UAE. We don't want to tell the obvious stories. There's many venues for that. We want to tell those stories through an arts medium with that artistic imagination about how we live. So this was an exhibition about the spaces in between buildings rather than the buildings themselves. This was a film by Najum Al-Ghanem at the last Fine Art Biennale, Contemporary Art Biennale. Exquisite exhibition, very, very well reviewed. And once again, it celebrates the artists and the storytellers that we have in the nation already. As I say, the purpose of these stories and the reason why the foundation is committed to them is that we want to tell our own stories from the people from here. And so, as I say, we keep collecting and bringing in research and examples from elsewhere. And we don't always contextualize them, but I think it's super important that we start collecting our own research and doing our own research on this place. I also want to sort of say a few words about art, and you know, so some of this, I appreciate this is a cultural summit, so many of you will already know what art is. But I do think that this conception of art is an asset class, that art is something we buy and then we put on a wall, but also art is something that we invest in, and we buy it and then we store it. And I think that there is absolutely a role for that. It's one of the world's most unregulated markets. You can buy one thing for one day at $5 and you can sell it for $1 million the next. But art has a much bigger role. And I think this is also what we're really interested in the foundation. We believe that art has a role in society and social cohesion, telling us who we are, identity, but also changing behaviors, also changing and engaging people in other ways of seeing, other ways of looking. Artists work and look hard at things, and then they work long and hard to tell us what they saw. And in that, we start seeing issues of humanity, issues of ourselves, and we perhaps see things that we hadn't seen before, or we bring attention to things we haven't seen before. And also in the current sort of pandemic world we're living in, it also has a role in the way we manage anxieties, mental health, the way we express, the way we cope with things. Art is also about imagination. So it is this artistic imagination, this artistic imagining that we see. We believe that technology follows imagination. So let's think about artists as thinkers, not just about the end artifact of art, but actually the way that artists look at the world, the way that they imagine new things, and the way they also critique new things. So we want to try and expand the role that we play in the foundation, where arts, culture and heritage is predominantly seen as something that's an asset class for investment or for tourism. But we know that there's a role between art and health and well-being. We know there's a role between arts, culture, heritage and cultural diplomacy, identity formation, community development, social cohesion. And really one of the key focuses that we started to develop in the foundation is really towards this notion of arts, culture and heritage for innovation and business. We believe that design and technology are enormous parts of the innovation process. We believe there are ways of bringing diverse ideas together and giving form to them. We believe that heritage and culture also offer inspiration for new storytelling, for new products, and as a resource for new ideas. And one of the key roles that artists plays, going back to that role of an artist as a thinker, is that artist is a key instigator of not just new ideas, but also as an agent of change, how art actually encourages to adopt new ideas. And so if we think about sort of businesses, and I know it's always sort of having argued not to always think about art in an economic sense, I'm going to give you some economic numbers. When we think of Cirque du Soleil, it's a business that's about $800 million turnover. What it does beyond its revenue in terms of the way people see themselves and the way that we have awe in things that we look at, the way they also contextualize the stories from different regions. So the role that Cirque du Soleil plays is beyond this $800 million revenue. It's actually a significant cultural content maker. Birkenstock, a company since 1774, currently valued at 4 billion euros. Once again, it's made from a historical position. It's made from a cultural craft tradition, and still a value and still existing. And so while we're focusing a lot on the technology sector, we want to make a case for also focusing on culture. We also want to make a case for not just thinking about unicorns, but thinking about these companies that will be around 400 years, will be around for a long, long time. Another company that's been around 400 years, Hermes, a 50 billion euro company. So these don't have to just be small agendas. They can be large agendas, but they have to start somewhere. They have to start small. And so how do we build arts, culture, and heritage into this broader agenda of innovation and thinking about work? And we're not the first ones to do it. This has been around for centuries. And one of the classic examples is Thomas Edison's Menlo Park in New Jersey, where you had artists sitting next to glassblowers, sitting next to engineers. And arguably, it was one of the places where we had the most number of patents per square meter. Other examples, Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, artists in residence working with technologists to come up with new ideas. This is where Windows, Ethernet, and the mouse, a lot of things that we used to really were imagined. And so that role of an artist in really allowing technology to have a home. And so how do we grow this sector? And Paul Graham, who's one of the co-founders of Y Combinator, just said this great line. He said, a government that asks, how can we build a Silicon Valley, is probably already ensured failure by the way they frame the question. You don't build a Silicon Valley, you let one grow. And so how does one grow this sector, this place for innovation where art and heritage can really sit toe to toe with entrepreneurs? So if we think of startup culture is usually sort of a half rabid capitalist wanting to make money, wanting to really grow as fast as they can, and half idealistic artist. You know, those purists that want to change the world through their ideas. Buildings don't fix that. What you need for that is people. All you need is a person around a kitchen table sharing ideas, making things. So the key thing that we need to start with for this culture to start is people. And smart, motivated people, we need to find them, we need to help them, and we need to encourage and mentor them. And so it's this area of artist and entrepreneur that we started becoming quite interested in, because it's creative people that build creative enterprises that go on to the private creative economy and creative identification. So we have to start with people. And so one of the key things that the foundation's been doing is really about capability building. And we know there's lots of trends. You know, you're all in the cultural summit here. You all understand the culture and the cultural economy and the creative economy. So I won't dwell on this slide, but it is a key part. And you're starting to see major countries around the world developing policies and investments into this area because they know it's important. Not only is small, medium enterprises important economic drivers for growth, they're also really important drivers for confidence, for the way we see ourselves, for the way we imagine ourselves. In a recent study of children in Abu Dhabi, there was an increasing trend for people to want to start and run their own businesses. There was incredible pride. So we're starting to see this coming in the next generation. And so we have to then talk about where are artists and designers and creative practitioners going to work? How is the economy changing? We don't really know what's happening post-COVID, but you know, we have some ideas. We also know that there are businesses that won't exist. We also know that the way we do business isn't going to exist, or it's going to change rapidly. So how do we respond to that? And what better person than the creative, imaginative practitioner to think that through? And that idea that we keep building spaces without thinking about what people are going to do all day. So as I say, the foundation's mission has always been about building the capabilities of the people of the UAE. And so this notion of what do people do all day is something that we are particularly interested in. We're particularly excited by this notion of work, this notion of livelihood, something that Sheikh Zayed constantly talked about. He wanted to give his people a livelihood. So how do we help people get a livelihood in a modern world? And how can we give them a livelihood that gives them skills that, should it change, they can also evolve and adapt? And so this notion of livelihood, well, one of the experiments that we're having really, and there's no answers to this stuff, these are just suggestions that we're trying to experiment with in our creative laboratory in Abu Dhabi. How does one actually build a livelihood in the future? How do we build homegrown brands? How do we build our own intellectual property that we can now export to the world? So rather than being seen as a culture of consumers, we start becoming a culture of producers and makers. It could be creative content makers, it could be cultural content makers. But how do we actually develop our own stories? How do we develop our own films? How do we develop our own anime? How do we develop our own shoes, etc.? And so how do we try and bring some of that diversity of thinking in because every nation in the world goes through this. Every nation has gone through issues of imitation to innovation, and then ultimately what we want to get to is disruption. And so what better group to disrupt than artists? And so artists to start looking at the world in different ways, but also presenting it in different ways. And so how do we frame some of this stuff? Because obviously we can make anything. We're in a world where we can design something right now on a computer. We can email it to China, and we can have it delivered in less than a week. But what is it that we want to focus on? So this work is really based on the excellent exhibition that Bruce Mao did called Massive Change. And it's also based on the work of the OECD in terms of what all nations need to pay attention to. So we're talking about design economies here, not your classic structure from economic theory, but design economies. And really thinking about any country in the world has to think about food. It has to think about food integrity, it has to think about not just food from a nutrition, but also a cultural perspective. We don't just eat nutrition, we eat things from a certain cultural perspective. We also have identity associated with that, and there's joy associated with that. So what does a food economy look like with food from the region, of the region? How do we connect it to our full supply chain, to the wonderful projects going on in terms of vertical farming, in terms of hydroponics? But how do we connect it to the consumer? How do we think about some of the packaging stuff that we need to think about? We sent a probe to Mars. What does food in space look like? You know, we live in a desert where people have to think about food preservation. What can that look like? What do those meals look like, and how can we design them? Movement economy. So we know we have to move not just people and goods, but also ideas around the world. So what is our role in thinking about movement? And movement also from the physical perspective of the human body. So we know we have issues in terms of the last kilometer that we need to travel when we get somewhere. What does that movement look like? What does that movement look like if you're in a wheelchair? What does that movement look like if you're impaired in some way? So there are lots of products that are starting to become developed in this area, and I think certainly we have an opportunity to experiment wildly across this area. The well-being economy. So once again, these are OECD areas that all countries in the world need to pay attention to. So what about their health and well-being? Even despite the costs of healthcare, the happiness index that we're talking about, how do we actually tap into that? There's a lot of local wisdom, historical wisdom, that we kind of forget in our rush to a modern world. So how can we use our own culture, our own old stories to actually create a well-being economy from here, of here? These economies are really just as a guiding post. They're not firm. You know, some of them they're made up. And the idea is that we want to provoke them as instigators for some of these artists and designers and creative practitioners to start working in, but also looking at spaces in between. So what is the movement economy and food economy? What happens in between? How can we use that as a creative direction? So as I say, we've got this idea of this notion of work, and now we want to get into some capability building. And so the three areas that we've started to focus that some of our activity in the foundation, Warehouse 4-to-1, obviously I mentioned that earlier, but we have plans to really start growing it into a space that puts education. So we're starting to really look at this academy model. If we are going to grow talent, we have to teach, we have to mentor, we have to collect, we have to share. If one of the things that we've all learned in this pandemic time is that learning is a social experience. Yes, we can certainly consume online, but actually we learn socially. And so creating a place for people to actually meet, share ideas, share art, and to actually have them change their view on things. We've also taken over the first public makerspace in Abu Dhabi. We know that globally makerspaces are key fuels for innovation in making, to try and build a culture of making. I think we certainly have a history of making in the UAE. It's been neglected a little bit, but I do think there's a huge opportunity to reconnect people to their hands. Most maker spaces are 3D printing spaces, really to do with technology. We really want to talk about traditional art. So we will have a lot of casting, we will have a lot of hand skills, a lot of textile skills in here. Because making can be as simple as folding paper to full 3D printing houses. So how do we engage people with those ambitions, and how do we actually get people making again? And so now you've got sort of a place to make. We also need a place to set your studios up. So one of the other projects we're currently developing is a hub, but a community-powered hub. So this isn't a hub where you are administered by other people, but you are self-administered. It's a cooperative. This is where it's a true community of practice and learning, where we are trying to get sharing across all entities and all participants. It's as I say, it's a community-powered model. So what you have is a place to talk about audiences, a place to make, and then a place to work. And ultimately what we're trying to do, and I love this image of the corniche and the harvesting of coral for building, homegrown. We're really interested in homegrown intellectual property from here that we can then take to the world. So those are sort of some of the key drivers. And so we've got these three entities that we sort of have as facilities to provoke and to engage people. We also know that entrepreneurial ecosystems, horizontal social structures, they work across things, they don't work vertically. So we want to make sure that we connect with Mazda City and the work that's going on in the environment. We want to make sure we connect with Hub 71, where you've got technology playing, because it's in these spaces and these collisions that we start seeing new ideas. And we don't know where they happen. They happen in events like the Cultural Summit. They happen in meetings. They happen in car parks. They happen in elevators, these serendipitous collisions. Every place in the world, whether it's Silicon Valley, Station F, or Hollywood, there are always cafes. There are always these restaurants where people collect and ideas are exchanged and these collisions happen. So how can we build those? And I think some of the role that we see DCT playing, that the Cultural Summit's playing, that we're all starting to see, is it's build awareness. We need to build awareness. We need to shift some of the conversation to hope. And we need to bias to action. So we don't just want to talk about it, we want to get people doing it. And so we want to make some of these sort of social connections that we're starting to see much more explicit. We want to make sure that we include people, because we don't know where ideas come from. We can speculate, we don't really know. And so that diversity of connections is really important. And so we want to create these social hotspots. And we also want to start being a keystone. So Warehouse 421, the makerspace and the hub, we want them to start being sort of key places where creators can meet and start sharing ideas. And so other activities we need to do, we will be sort of developing training vouchers. So if you are interested in Pimp My IKEA to start learning how to make furniture in our makerspace, we will be sending out some of those courses. We'll talk about micro acceleration. So rather than everyone becoming a unicorn, we just need to start exercising this muscle of entrepreneurship. So running competitions, hackathons, etc., but also celebrating. So these networks, we want to celebrate with our peers. We want to start connecting some of these ecosystems. And so what the location of Warehouse 421 is actually ideally placed in the middle of culture. So you've just to the east there, you've got the cultural district. And so even if we think about places like Station F in terms of its focus on technology, it's in the middle of Paris. It's in the middle of a huge cultural district. And so this idea that people and culture start really not only making things more livable, but as a source of ideas, that is something that we really want to try and explore and push. And so part of it is, how do we give people access to great ideas, to talent, to capital? And so these are some of the projects and questions that we're trying to develop over the next few years. This is not a short-term agenda. And so thinking about an ecosystem, this sense of place through these sort of social hotspots is super important. This is where you want to start people feeling like they belong. They can find people like themselves, not only people like themselves, but they can also find people who know things that they might not know. But you have to develop talent. So there's got to be a capability building arm. It's great to see 42 Abu Dhabi, a coding school coming to Abu Dhabi to start really building some of the skill sets that we're going to need for the future of work. As I say, we have a number of incubators that we're looking at. We have them across the board. Can we join them together? Can we start looking at that diversity between Hub 71 and the tech sector, maybe the arts? What is the role of media and filmmaking in terms of gaming? So these areas and these collisions start becoming really important, but how can we support people? How can we provide that education and training? Then, of course, we need companies. So you've got people, you also need companies. We need to start also thinking about a diverse ecosystem with small, medium, large companies in there. We also need some of the larger entities like ADNOC, this more diverse model. And so could we bring them to the party? And I think I won't dwell on this slide, but I do want to bring up one of the other big things that I think art and design really have a role to play, and that's connecting to the consumer. That it's the place where we get really into our consumer technology, where we start thinking about media and influencers, the sort of, let's say, beta testing of ideas. That's where people matter, and that's the way we design interfaces, etc. matter, and that's a really important role that art and design can play. So what we're trying to do is trying to build a culture of innovation. We're trying to really embed art at the heart of that innovation. And so art, not just as an artifact or an endpoint, but art as a process and as a way of thinking, as a practice. And so not only in the instigation of ideas, but also in the way that ideas are consumed and that the ideas are presented back to us. And trying to build a commercial agenda around that. And so not, trying to give people that livelihood. The number of times we hear artists being asked to work for free is something that we desperately want to change. Art should be valued. It is a very serious practice. And so how do we do that? So this is both bottom up and top down. Governments are arguably not the best people to drive cultural change. So how do we actually put the circumstances in place? And so we really, we will need to be working at policy level as well to do that. But at the moment, we're working at that community level, really trying to find the people who are the key fuel of this art-led innovation agenda. And I just want to reinforce this again. So just that notion that we believe strongly that it's not just about art as an endpoint, but art and design as a way of thinking and as a way of fueling the innovation process, but also as a source of ideas. Culture and heritage is unique to this place. How do we actually think of that? How do we develop our own Birkenstock from this region? How can we build that into our own €4 billion company? And we believe that art and design and culture are huge resources and assets that we're sitting on, and we're not the only ones. I normally sort of say welcome. So of course, this is a community talk. So hello, Maraba, welcome, and thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please do feel free to contact me.